Awesome. We good? Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for coming out today. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll all get something good out of this class. My name is Jake Summers. I'm the growing manager here at Martha's Community Farm. Been here about 2.5 years. We're in our 5th growing season, and ever since Emma's gotten here, we've been able to do a lot more of these workshops, which is great. So today we're going to be talking about soil blocking. It's a method of propagating plants. And we'll talk about why we're doing that, some of the materials we'll need, our recipe we use, what the actual soil blocker implements themselves. And I'll do a demonstration of making them. And then everyone will get to try it themselves. There'll be a hands-on portion afterwards, after the speaking portion. And we'll get to go in the back, make the soil blocks, put some seeds in we have set out there, and you can take them home. So, and if you have questions as we're going along, if something's not clear, I don't explain anything, just feel free to ask. So, soil blocks, it's a method of plant propagation. The conventional way of growing plants in greenhouses tends to be trays with many plastic cells that you fill with soil. And, it's worked for many years. And then someone thought of the idea of, well, what if we took the plastic out of the equation? What if we could make the soil stand on its own without having to use disposable plastic, or at least as much of it, and also get healthier plants? So how are they healthier? How do we get healthier plants out of these? So this is a soil block. This is a dry soil block that we made weeks ago. They shouldn't ever really look like this when you're using them. But basically, the concept is that when the plant's growing, as the plant grows and it's putting out the roots, at some point the root will reach the end of the soil. And roots won't, most plants, especially in agriculture, don't survive in air. They need air to breathe, but if they're exposed to it constantly, they dry up and they'll die. And so what you get is a root tip that is just at the edge of the soil block, waiting for soil so it can grow, waiting to establish. And so once you get a good sized plant, you can put it in the ground outside when it's warm enough, and you get a lot less transplant shock. You get a really vigorous, healthy root system, takes less time to establish, and all of that great stuff. And in addition, as I mentioned, those plastic trays with a lot of cells, when the roots hit those, normally, well, they don't stop growing. They keep growing, and they'll start to circle and girdle. And the problem with that is when you're getting ready to plant them, if you're not constantly keeping an eye on them and potting them up, you have to kind of tear up the roots a bit to make sure that they're not going to stay in that orientation when you put them in the ground. And that adds more shock to the plant, and it just creates, again, all the opposite of what I just mentioned for the soil block. So it takes more time to establish, more shock, things like that. In addition, one other benefit of using soil blocks is that, as you'll see later, and when I make them and when you make them, when you make a soil block, you're compressing soil down. So there's a high amount of soil in the block, and so it has more nutrients in that amount of space than it would normally, and so you actually don't need to pot them up as frequently as you might otherwise, because there's a lot more nutrients in the soil block. I will say they don't work for everything. They're great for a lot of things. Theoretically, I suppose they could work for everything, but some things like onions that really prefer long roots, it's a very inefficient way of growing something like that. I'm sure you could do it. We haven't had a lot of success with it, but there are some plants that it does really well with. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the materials that are involved. So here are our soil blockers themselves, and you can get these from a variety of different sources online if you just Google soil blockers. And this is our kind of germination soil blockers. So these are really, really small ones. There's a design where they come out in these little blocks, and then what you can get are they're called the dibbles. So that's what these are, little dibbles. And you can get ones that are square. And the idea is as these grow up, you can pop them up into a larger size. So you can't do this forever. You could actually, if you made your own dibbles, like I've seen people online make their own soil blocks, but most people don't. So you can pot up these smaller ones into that size, or even a much larger size, such as this one, which is a kind of stand-up soil blocker. We just got this year. We haven't really used it yet. We're planning on using it soon for some things like peppers and tomatoes. And then this is a slightly larger size one. There's 5 blocks in this one. It's about 1.5 inches by, I think, 1.25 inches or something around there. This is a similar size, but it's more of like a commercial one. So there's 12 cells in this, and just makes it a little faster, but definitely not necessary for just home growing. And then on the back table there's one that's slightly larger than this. I think it's more around 2 inches. And that only has 4 cells. So, depending on what the plant requires, you may want to use one or the other, or start in the small one and pot them up. These small ones do tend to dry out a lot faster, so you do have to keep up with watering them and make sure they're not drying out too much. But that's kind of what they look like, and as I mentioned, there's a few different sources for buying those online. So when you're making them, you're gonna make them in some sort of tray, and there's a few different options for that. So we can use a plastic tray, and this is a cheaper type of plastic tray. They don't last as long. You can see this one's already cracked. They work fine in a pinch, but for more to last longer, we could get a nicer tray like this one. It's a lot thicker. This one came from Johnny Selected Seeds, but I'm sure there's a lot of other sources for these. And this will last for a lot more years. So they are more expensive, but sometimes it's worth it to invest in a nicer tray that'll last you more than 1 or 2 years. In addition, you can use a wooden tray. These are all the rage these days. You can just repurpose any sort of shelf or something and soil block right in there. And then, in a way, you can kind of use anything you can think of. So your creativity is your limit here, really. You can use a takeout container, just a plastic, any sort of plastic thing to put the blocks onto. We'll be giving you guys these to take home today if you need them. So really can be any sort of tray. And in addition, you can use humidity domes such as these, and those do what they sound. They just keep in the humidity so you don't have to water them quite as much, especially when you're just germinating those seeds. Once they come up, you can kind of take them off and not really worry about them. But if you don't, if you're just doing, like, let's say out of a takeout container, you can just use, the top as the humidity dome, or you can use a thin layer of saran wrap, not pulled on, just kind of lightly laid over, or bubble wrap or something like that. So a lot of options, right, with what materials you can use, and you can really reuse a lot, repurpose a lot of household items. One other thing I should mention is that not really necessary in a home growing scale, but they make these trays as well. And when we get into the watering part of it, you can put your blocks right on these trays, and then use the solid tray as your watering tray. So you can just set it in there with a layer of water, and it's called bottom watering. So the roots will absorb the water from the bottom, and it won't disturb the soil blocks quite so much. Because there's no plastic holding them, if you're just using a watering can, it can kind of break them down a bit over time. So we definitely recommend bottom watering the soil blocks when using them. Okay, so those are some of the growing tray options. Okay, so now the growing medium. What are we using to make these blocks? You can buy a pre-made mix. That's the easiest way to do it. It's also the most expensive. Vermont Compost Company is the one I hear the most often used. They have, I think it's Fort V mix that tends to be really popular with growers. I haven't used it myself, but I've heard really good things about that. You can get it in a small bag. The growers I've seen will get it in on a pallet. It's like, $500 or something, plus shipping. So it, ends up being probably like 1,000. But we've decided to make our own mix here to save on cost and to be able to, alter it if need be. So what's the recipe? Well, we're going to go through the different ingredients and talk about what the purpose is for them. So the first one is peat moss that we like to use. This is a binder, really helps to kind of hold it all together, and it retains moisture. So that's, I would say, the main purpose of this. There's a lot going on right now about peat and the sustainability of peat. When we one of the reasons we bought this is because it was inexpensive, and we didn't necessarily know about those environmental issues at the time. So it's sensitive habitat. When it's mined for peat, it releases a lot of carbon, and there's a lot of concerns about what that's doing, and it's mainly the horticultural industry that uses a lot of this peat. So people have been experimenting with other options. Coconut coir, I believe it's pronounced, is one. Great substitute. It's a little stringier. I've heard it can kind of get caught up in the soil blocks a little more. It also comes most of the time from Sri Lanka, I believe, or halfway around the world. So then there's these shipping emissions. You can't win, I tell you. But a lot of people talk about that as a nice replacement. Pit moss is another one, not peat moss, but pit moss. Again, I've never used it. It's kind of a recycled paper material. Looks like shredded recycled paper. Supposed to serve the same function. And another one that I also can't speak of personally is sheep's wool. Just plain old sheep's wool seems to be able to be a good replacement. It's very popular in the permaculture. What's that? Yeah, kind of shredded up. So yeah, shredded up. People are getting all these ideas, and hey, if you have access to that, no problem with it. If you have to use it, try to use less, right? You can try to limit your usage of a material like this. So when we run out of the peat we've purchased, we may look at an alternate binder and moisture retainer, such as the peat. We also we've also sifted this. So if you have like large chunks of sticks or pellets of peat or anything, that'll tend to make the soil blocking a little more difficult. Those things can get jammed up in the blocks and make it a little more crumbly. So this has been pre-sifted, which I recommend. And we just built a sifter with like hardware cloth and simple wooden frame. It was nothing fancy. Okay, so that's the peat. And one other thing about using less peat is that, and this is a lesson we learned, was that instead of starting everything in a larger block and then some things don't germinate and then you have these soil blocks that maybe you're ditching, start with the smaller size. So that way if things don't germinate, if you don't have success, you're not using as much material, and if you do have some failures, it's not as big of a loss of resources. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Okay. Next, we will use some compost. And I believe the recipe for this is on the sheets there. But compost, probably some nice, homemade. If you have homemade compost, that's great. If you want to buy some organic stuff, this is just a organic leaf compost that we got from Home Depot. Nothing fancy about it, but it works. And this is mostly to add nutrients, the purpose of the compost. Of course, it also has some moisture retention properties as well. So we'll add in a few parts compost, perlite. So the perlite is naturally mined mineral. And this is really strictly for drainage. This is really the only thing we're going to add that's going to help with drainage. There are some other, I've seen some like perlite free recipes. I can't remember what they replaced it with, but I would use perlite. It tends to work the best. Excuse me, it's a little dusty. We've had a lot of success with using it. So we'll add in some perlite for drainage. And then this is just regular old garden soil. So we didn't use this last year, and we decided to switch it up this year and add it. Conventionally, this is always an ingredient. One concern was like, okay, we might be bringing in outside pathogens, and that could affect the health of the plants. But there's the flip side of that too, which is that you're introducing beneficial microbes, mycorrhizae, fungi, bacteria, things like that. So, and the other thing about the garden soil is that there's clay in it, so that's going to help bind everything together, and this will also help retain water as well.
Last year, did you just use the other ingredients?
Exactly. Yeah, we just didn't use the. We used a little more compost instead of the soil. Finally, we'll add a little bit of. This is called green sand. It has iron. It's just another fertilizer we'll add here. Rock phosphate for some phosphorus. And this is blood meal, which adds nitrogen, high nitrogen. I'm not going to pretend that, I know I just kind of add a little bit. There's probably a more scientific way of doing that. If you look up recipes, they usually include some variations of these in small amounts. They do differ. But one thing I should mention with soil blocking is that unlike most growing, when you're just using normal potting mix, because there's so many nutrients in this mix, you don't really have to add fertilizer until you can just kind of grow them usually well until the plants are ready to go in the ground. Okay, so final ingredient, water. And this is the trickiest part in a way, getting the right amount of water. If the mix is too dry when you go to make it, they'll crumble apart. And with repeated waterings, even if it kind of stays together initially, they'll kind of dissolve over time. If it is too wet, you won't have enough pore space, and they will sometimes not even hold their form, and they'll kind of just slop out of the mold there. So I would say, in a way, this is the most difficult part of the whole thing. So, if you're making it in batches, you can experiment with trying to get the exact amount right. I kind of do it by feel and by eye. We're in a situation where if we do add a little too much water, we can just add more of the other ingredients. But I would kind of add it slowly and kind of see. So soil, the soil block mix is much wetter than normal potting soil is. So normally, it doesn't have, it's a little damp maybe. You're going to water it in after you seed it. But this stuff is going to be really wet, almost dripping when you squeeze it, like almost water dripping out of your fingers. It's good to have a mixing area. We use these. You can really use anything, bucket, wheelbarrow, whatever strikes your fancy to mix in. And when you are making them, you can use a heat mat, like a germination mat. We have over on that table there to help speed up the germination of the blocks. Definitely not necessary, but some plants, like if you're doing peppers, they like a really warm temperature, around 70, 80 degrees to germinate. So they're helpful for that. Let's see. And then of course lights, right? Grow lights. If you're doing this inside, we don't we're not using any right now. We're in the greenhouse. There's plenty of light that's coming through. If we wanted to grow throughout the winter, though, we would need to invest in some nice lights, and we do plan on doing that in the future. So I'm just mixing and I'm adding water, just alternating, and I do want it to get pretty nice and moist here. You can see it's starting to clump together a little bit, turning a darker color. The peat is like the lightest part there, so that's kind of what I'm keeping an eye on. It's still pretty dry. Now this is maybe more like the normal consistency of potting soil, but this is still much too dry for our needs for soil blocking. I'm going to keep adding water here, just kind of go back and forth. Any questions so far? Yes, Lynn.
For the garden soil, you said, where do you get it? Are you buying a bag? Digging it from the garden?
Yeah, you could dig it from your garden, some like nice topsoil or something. That's probably the best thing to do. We, we got some from a landscape supply company that's local. We had to get soil when we made our raised boxes to fill them up. It was like a combination of screen topsoil, I think mushroom compost and leaf compost. Elliot Coleman is he wrote some pretty great books on this, and I don't know if he was the first. He's the one that usually comes up when talking about soil blocking. I think he may have been the first one to kind of come up with this idea, and he developed a lot of, or at least made famous a lot of tools for market gardeners and things like that. But his recipe is like often mentioned as like the original recipe, and that's what he always says to use garden soil. So it contradicts a lot of things that we think about when we think about using potting soil. They're always soilless grow mixes if you buy in a bag, but not this. So okay, so this is still too dry. It's quite crumbly. So I'm gonna just again keep adding water here. And like I said, this is really the hardest part of the whole thing. Getting the ingredients, adding them together is not too difficult, but getting the right feel and consistency of the soil blocks is something that. So I grab it, and there's a couple drops that are coming out. This probably isn't all like wet enough, but I think this amount is. Just gonna wash my hands real quick. Okay, so I'll take the germination soil block here, and this is an important thing too, that to have the cells filled, you kind of do have to put a good bit of pressure down on the blocks. So it is an area where you kind of want to be pretty firm with them. So I'm not going to worry about this tab right now. I'm just going to grab the lower part here, and I'm going to push down. And you can even kind of take what you might think of as like a couple bites of soil as you do this. Can everyone see over there? Okay, cool. You're going to you can use a trowel. This is a tool that was, sold for this, but anything really would work. And going to scrape off the bottom there. You want it nice and flat, because when they go down, if they're not flat, when you water them, they can sort of tip and again disintegrate. So I think I've got my cells pretty well filled. It seems to be a pretty good moisture consistency. At this point, I'm going to pull up on this tab as I push down on that. And voila, here are my little blocks. So pretty nifty. They'll stay together. What was that? 20 blocks right there. So that was once you get the mix, it's pretty pretty fast going. And these have a little dibble in them, so you can just throw a seed right in. We can try it with a larger one too. So it's going to be the same thing. You're going to kind of just press down. Really want to make sure all those cells are filled. It's usually the top corners that don't quite get enough material in there. So fill them. I'm going to just kind of level it off pretty nice. And once again, just pull up on this tab as I push down. And we have the soil blocks. This one, maybe I didn't quite fill perfectly. They don't have to be perfect, honestly. It looks nice when they are, but the plants are going to grow just as nice. Once you put the seed in, most seeds like darkness to germinate. Some need light, but most don't. You can just take a little bit of your mix and just kind of cover it. We got a bag of fine vermiculite. We're going to see if that maybe helps instead of the soil. We were worried that maybe the seeds had a tough time pushing up through some of this material when we covered them. I don't know if that's the case or not, but we thought we would experiment with some fine vermiculite too this year. Any questions about the demonstration? Okay, so you're going to want to keep the soil blocks pretty moist until they germinate. Like I said, you can use the a humidity dome to help keep them dry, especially wet, especially those small ones, so they don't dry out. You don't want to keep them sopping wet. You don't want there to be standing water in the tray. If you're going to water them, like those small ones, you could take a small watering can or something like this and kind of just pour around them, let them soak up the moisture. If there's a little excess moisture, you could pour it off. That's why we use this tray, is because we can just fill the bottom one with water, have them soak up 10-15 minutes, and then just remove it and let it drip off any excess. So it just kind of helps a little bit. So same thing for these ones really too. I would try to bottom water as much as you can. If you do use this conventional sort of watering can with this rose, they call it, the force of the water falling could break them apart. I suppose you could try to use something that's even finer, like a mister. You could experiment with that and see if it works, and it may be fine to use, but we definitely recommend at least trying the bottom watering. So that's watering. Depending on what it is, some of the stuff today is considered cool weather. So once they kind of come up and they seem large, you could start to try to harden them off, which is just bring them inside, an hour a day, or kind of increasing that amount every day for about a week or so. They get used to the intensity of the sunlight, the wind, the cool weather. Some of this stuff you could just keep outside too. They're cool weather. They're going to come up when they're ready. So that's definitely another option. If not, find a south-facing windowsill or something like that. Try to get a good amount of light on them. And then when they come up, you could either pop them up and kind of, like, we're going to be doing lettuce in these, or greens in the little ones and peas in the larger ones today. So the lettuce you may want to try to pot up into a larger size, or you could just try to put them right out in the garden and see how they do. Everyone feel?
There's different size blocks.
Yeah.
So are there different types of plants that are suitable for the different sizes?
Good question. Yeah. So, with these, you can sort of start a lot with I kind of think of these as like a germination block. So you can kind of start most things in here, and then things that might need a larger root system, like a tomato or a pepper plant, eggplants, you would want to definitely move up to a larger block, even like a really large block such as that one. Other plants, you may just want to, like, again, like if you're doing greens or something, you don't necessarily need this big root system for greens. So some plants you probably don't want a soil block at all, right? So like carrots, you could do beets, I suppose, but things with like those root crops, they don't love to be transplanted. They kind of just like to grow where they are. So those I would just I would direct seed right outside. Same with radishes. They're so fast anyway that it doesn't really make sense. You could do beans. You could do beans in like a larger size, such as these. A lot of people direct seed cucurbits like squash and watermelon and pumpkins, but there's no reason you couldn't, if you wanted to get a head start, you couldn't use a soil block for those too. And I would then use a larger size. So I would say it kind of depends on the root system of the plant. If it's a plant that's going to get really large, you're going to want to step it up into a larger block.
Ask about whether it outgrows that block. So if I was growing a tomato plant,
Right.
Planted it now, and plant it outside into Mother's Day or something.
Right.
It might be too big for that.
Yeah, good question. So with tomatoes, we're planning on starting those sorts of things. It's 6 to 8 weeks, they usually say. So if you're going, we usually think in this area it's like May 15th is that last frost date. So that's been conventionally true. I don't know if that continues to be true, but yeah, to answer your question, I think that they probably could do okay in these for like 6 to 8 weeks. Maybe the slightly bigger size than this would be better. And if you do have a even larger size, that would probably be best. Now, if let's say that let's say you're 5 or 6 weeks in, you're not ready to plant for another couple weeks, and you're like, man, these are really going. You can always just pot them up, put some more soil around them. You don't necessarily have to stick to the soil block. So I don't want you to think that like once it's in here, I can't do anything until it goes in the ground. So if you're feeling like, man, I really don't have the time, or I have a lot more time before I can put this out, just you could just take a regular pot, put more potting soil around it. You could do it. I would. It depends how much you're doing, but yeah, you lose the benefit. Yeah, right. And then you're using all this extra soil as well. So in my experience, I would just maybe either start to harden them off, or they should be fine. As long as they don't get too leggy, which probably means the light source isn't close enough to them and they're reaching for light. The roots are going to kind of keep dying off. So I suppose if you start it really, really early, they may use up all the nutrients, but that's more of a timing thing, I'd say. Does that answer your question?
So you would be starting tomatoes around the 1st of April.
Yep. That's when we're planning on doing ours.
Block that size.
So we'll probably start them in the smaller ones and then quickly pot them up. Oh, one thing I mentioned, I'll grab it, or the one with the dibbles on it. So that's kind of the cool thing about this system, is that you can start them in these small blocks, as I mentioned. If they don't succeed, just toss them, try to use it again. But if they do succeed, this is kind of the idea, that you can get one with these square dibbles. So you're going to make kind of the same thing, make your blocks, and then when these are crumbling apart a little bit because I rushed it, but then they'll have that. So you can maybe start the tomato in there, and then once it gets a little bigger, you can just put it in the larger block. Yeah. Everyone ready to make some? All right, great.